4.3 Part 1. So we're going to look at art and the cycle of life, and we're going to look at life's beginnings and endings as our first subheading. So one thing we want to keep in mind, this does cover prehistory into modern day, but most of our existence as humans, we haven't had a lot of um, surety. I know it sounds like, when we look at the past, it seems more stable than the present, but that isn't necessarily so. There was a lot of death during childbirth, for example, and diseases and things happening to people, and weather. There was no weatherman, if we're looking, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, and further back, or even 500 years ago. No one's going to be able to tell you, what's coming in the future, or you know, the about the life's mysteries. So a lot of questions about why we're here, what happens when we die, what happens during birth. So a lot of artwork that we see in the world, and even still today, is going to be that's going to be the subject matter. What are the important gods and goddesses to do with childbirth? What are the procedures for or the um, rites of death and birth, that kind of thing. So we're going to look at that just to begin with. Creation myths, stories about the process of childbirth, and beliefs of an entire community. And we're going to start with Tlazitteotl giving birth to the maize god. Now, we're looking at her face and we can see the strain in this posture. She's squatting, and then she has a sort of a miniature human. Doesn't look that baby-like to us, but her face is quite skull-like, and she's kind of a dual deity or a dual god. She's responsible for giving disease and taking away disease at the end of life. She removes the sin and disease from a person. So she has a dual personality. She can cure disease as well as give it. And also, she's a life giver, but also she's there at the end of life. And she's also called the filth eater because she would absolve them of their sins. So she's kind of got this death-like look on, death mask, sort of skull-like look on her face. And interestingly enough, there's some holes here. So some other ornaments might have been there, or it could even be textiles that were hanging from here. But she is sculpted here, carved out of granite, and you can see some realistic details. The nose is quite realistic. We get that sort of clavicle bone. The breasts are very small. The legs are probably a bit exaggerated and large. The feet are simplified. But she is demonstrating a posture of birth. Now, this is not a familiar posture to us necessarily, but different cultures have different birth postures, and she's demonstrating that here. And we're looking at an Aztec piece, central Mexico, around the year 1500. So we're thinking that that Columbus or uh, not Coronado. I'm sorry, I blanked on Cortez is what I'm trying to think of. Are around during this time in Mexico, but these would be very important statues to look at the cycle of birth and death here. So the Aztec women are thought of as war heroes because they're on the front of creating the culture, if that makes sense. They're going through a battle in terms of childbirth. It's a long process. It can be a couple of days. Sometimes birth happens in a couple of hours, but sometimes it's a couple of days. And of course, this is without medical help. These women are just toughening it out. There's no pain medication, perhaps. There's no any way to sort of speed things up. She's just got to kind of tough it out. So she's at the she's at the forefront of the battlefield in the beginning of life. So there's a long list here. She's the Earth Mother, patron of childbirth, and responsible for curing and giving disease. But she's a life giver, but also feared as powerful. So many cultures kind of have this idea of balancing the god's power or appeasing the gods to keep that balance between life giving and death. We're going to look at a very different example. Dijkstra's, Rinneke Dijkstra's, Julie Den Haag in the Netherlands. This is right after she gave birth, about an hour later. And we're kind of looking at the reality of, or in the book says a stark reality, which is quite true, of what modern day childbirth looks like immediately after. So, obviously she's probably still in quite a bit of pain. The baby's been born, but very, very new, fresh, and I mean, she hasn't had a chance to probably have a shower or anything like that. She's just gone through this incredibly painful process, and they've given her sort of a feminine pad kind of a thing, and that's it. It's just her, she's got this blank background. So our photographer here is sort of changing the way we look at the privacy and the sort of idealization of childbirth, and she's giving us sort of like a cold and anonymous look at the idea of what childbirth really actually looks like. So there's a lot of vulnerability here, and this woman is just kind of taking this on. Probably has a relationship with the artist. It's probably not completely terrifying to her, but it's certainly a vulnerable moment, and she's just really letting it all show, and that's kind of rare and unusual. So this artist is kind of taking that approach to sort of show us something raw and unusual and vulnerable. So it's right after birth, unconventional. It's capturing the awkwardness and the strength. I think there's both in her face, like she's feeling strong and holding the baby and standing in a very stable posture, but she's kind of got a dazed look on her face, like she's not quite sure what just happened. Our next one we're going to look at from 1480, Renaissance era, Andrea Mantegna, and this is Tempera on canvas. Now, this is Christ, and you can see sort of his punctures from the cross, his stigmata, and he's cropped so that we barely even see Mary and Mary Magdalene over here as well. But this is sort of an idealized body form, and this is supposed to emphasize the miraculous nature of Christ's resurrection. So we just looked at two images of birth. We're looking at two images now of death, and this is the dead Christ. So this is kind of an unusual depiction. Not completely unusual. There are other ones. It's not the only one. Before he's resurrected, and that grief moment, that moment where they're before he's resurrected and before it's more hopeful, if that makes sense. So we see a lifeless face, and there's grief in this scene, that we're worried that his life is over. So it's foreshortened. This would be, which means like a really oblique angle. We're looking very closely, like he's all sort of layering on top of himself. The head is quite large. If in reality you were drawing this correctly, his feet would be quite a bit bigger. He's shrunk the feet down just a little bit just to fit them, so not blocking the view. This is unfortunately an actual corpse, a photograph of a gunshot victim. Andres Serrano did a lot of images in the 80s and 90s that were sort of poking at taboos. He was sort of looking at different dead. This is the Morgue series. That's one series he did. He did some other religious series as well. But he was really just trying to identify them by the manner of their death and think about the shocking reality, of the murder. So it's a real intense. I wouldn't say it's exactly shock value because there's a lot of beauty and care in this photo too. You just see the way the body's laid out in kind of a careful way. But again, it's similar to our birth photo that we looked at, where there's sort of this modern day um, way to deal with bodily fluids, just to sort of like put a diaper on someone. I wouldn't, in a lot of cases, you might think that's humiliating or not respecting the body. But he probably just had an autopsy and then, or a surgery, and it failed. And so he's here just post mortem, waiting, going to the coroner perhaps. This is probably, since these were in the morgue, he's already gone to the coroner, but the coroner may or may not have worked on him yet. We don't know. One of the things that it points out too is that how unfamiliar we are with death imagery, and Andres Serrano is trying to point that out. More often in the past, you would have the dead body at home for a number of days. Now we live in a warmer climate, and that would be very difficult. And there probably would be other methodologies, probably like burning the corpse or something like that, that would be more traditional to a hotter climate. But usually what has happened, the person dies at their home. They wouldn't have gone to the hospital, and I'm talking, before our modern era, before the Industrial Revolution, the last 150, 200 years. The person would be at home, either on a table or in a coffin, kind of elevated, and people would come by. And all the flowers that you would give to the family, a lot of those were, and the candles and so on, that was sort of to mask the smell, perhaps, of the body decaying. But that would go on for a couple of days. People would see this dead person that they knew in their life, that was their neighbor, was their friend or their family member, and they would observe them and get to know the reality that that person has really passed, and get to do some rituals and things like that. So Andres Serrano is sort of turning that on its head, and we're just kind of looking at a dead person's body, but he's not identified as a friend or a loved one. He's just kind of a random person that we don't really know. So there's a disconnect there, if that makes sense. But it's also sort of like shaking the idea of how we've anesthetized the dead body. We don't see that nowadays in our culture. We don't handle it ourselves. It goes to a mortuary. We don't deal with death. So that's his commentary there. So there's some formal beauty, definitely. He's got some beautiful musculature. He's laid out in a really careful way. So that's part of the contradiction there. And Andres Serrano is known for that. Beautiful images, very dark themes, usually to do with death.